think we're facing a crisis of governance in general. I wouldn't say that it's only the democracies, though the high-income democracies have a particular problem. But nobody is having a very easy time with globalization in general, with governing when capital is so mobile, when the world's population is so large and still rising rapidly, and when environmental damage is already upon us and we're entering a new era of instability because of climatic and other environmental hazards and shocks. So I think that this is a crisis in general that's pretty serious and that is certainly not solved anywhere. I don't think China's going to get an easy pass on this, certainly not Russia getting an easy pass on this. The high-income countries have an added issue. They have the advantage of being high-income countries with plenty of buffer, but as mature economies in a world of mobile capital, they've also faced a certain kind of stagnation as the poorer countries are catching up, and that's adding to a particular set of challenges. But when you have soaring oil prices, soaring food prices, climate instability, massive droughts that turn into conflict zones, like in the Horn of Africa or like Mali's coup right now, and mass migration, which is making societies much more diverse and much less centered on clear shared values. I think governance is very, very tough for nation states everywhere right now.
Yeah, I think you put the question very interestingly when you say the technocratic governments that have been put in place in Greece and Italy and other populations looking longingly at China and saying, you know, that's how we want government to look. I think that's really falling into an argument beloved of many economists. And the argument is economics is too complicated to leave to politicians, and that most of politics is venal and corrupt. And therefore, all any country needs is a technocratic, independent group of economists to run the country.
Yeah.
And I think...
What a beautiful picture.
And I think, alas, Jeff, that's profoundly wrong. And I think that when people say democracy is in crisis, they're usually not talking about what the economists are talking about. They're saying that democracies are struggling. And they're struggling with some pretty fundamental things. They're struggling to ensure that the rule of law is abided by and enforced, including by those who make the law. And that was some of the disaffection in Italy. It was the sense that their elected government, Berlusconi, was acting above the law and not acting within the law. And so what's happened in Italy is, yes, you've had a technocratic government come to power, but it is one that many Italians see as a government which is more abiding of a rule of law. And democracy is not just about being elected. It's about a government that sits under its own law, is accountable to it, and it's about the protection of minorities. Democracy, in no account, is about just mob rule by a majority. And I think it's those elements. So when we look at the Arab Spring, that was a yearning to have governments that sit under the rule of law. It was a reaction against Ben Ali and other dictators who not just enriched themselves, but corruptly used the law aggressively for their own enrichment and for their own purposes. And it's that people are revolting against.
David, let's come to you. I think interesting, Nairi mentioned the Arab Spring, and that's this other part of this, that as one part of the world is yearning and risking its life for democracy, here's the other part of the world, the mature democracies, if you like, who are finding that it's sometimes a bit lacking when it comes to dealing with crises like this. But what's your take?
My perspective on this is that this is a fabulous age of democratization. And it's a fabulous age of democratization right across the global village. It's not just happening in the Arab world or in Russia or in China, where open societies are providing access to information for better educated populations than ever before. It's also that in our own Western societies, the democratization of political relationships, never mind personal and other relationships, has gone hugely far. What does that mean? It means that the bar for the legitimate exercise of power has been raised in political situations, in social situations, in economic situations. In other words, Whether you're living in a democratic country which has elections or an undemocratic autocracy, those who wield power have to take more account of those who they're wielding power over. That's why it's a fabulous age of democratization. Chinese call it opening up. It was certainly part of the Arab Spring, if you want to call it that, the Arab revolts. So as far as that goes, I think you've got a one-way trend.
It might be a little bit of a cop-out to slip off into global interdependence. Because what about the challenges of democracy even here in Britain? The challenge of a government, either government, the previous one or this government, who actually failed to apply the law. They failed to apply the law to their own banking system. They failed to apply the law to the press. They failed to apply the law to the police. And that, I think, is part of the public disaffection with democracy. It says, well, what is democracy? Is it the rules that you can buy if you're very, very wealthy, if you're a Rupert Murdoch or if you're a Citigroup? Is democracy about what you can buy as a set of rules? And is that why they look with some yearning at China and Singapore and say, well, those governments are not democratically elected, but they seem to be delivering more to their population. And in some areas, they seem to apply the rules that they have in some areas. Let's be careful here. I mean, I'm not a sympathizer with that view. I think every democracy has to keep reinventing itself. And I think, and I'm sure we'll get to it in this conversation, that there are some specific things that this country can do and other countries can do to re-energize and strengthen their democracies. But I think we risk saying globalization and independence makes it all too difficult, and governments are buffeted by these tremendous wins that they've set up through globalization. I don't believe that. I think globalization means you need smarter, more effective, more responsive government, and I think it can be that. But we should hold each of our own governments to account.
There's a real problem. I mean, Greece is insolvent. Mm-hmm. That's not just a problem for bond markets. Greece is insolvent. So this hasn't been invented. France has not run a budget surplus for 42 years. Right? So there's a real issue that should concern you whether or not you're a bond trader. Second, the austerity, the collective austerity that's been imposed across Europe is a political decision. Now, the fact that in aid of it is preyed the spectre of the bond markets shouldn't obscure the fact that this is a very dominant centre-right in Europe, 24 of 27 European countries from the centre-right, embracing a pre-Keynesian economic theory and using the threat of debt default as the argument for every country to pursue austerity at the same time.
But is Osborne wrong then?
Yes,
on that point, if he did stimulate the economy and didn't cut the deficit, would the bond market say that's fine? We're going to lend you money at the same rate.
If he said I don't care about the deficit and we're never going to repay our debts, of course he'd have trouble in the bond markets. But that is not the issue. The issue is to move from a deficit reduction strategy to a masochistic strangulation strategy, which is what he's done. And when you strangle the body economic, surprise, surprise, it loses blood from and stops twitching. I mean, we're 0.8% growth in this country as a result of a masochistic economic strategy. But that is a political decision. In Germany, they've just announced they're going to tighten fiscal policy. They're a massive European surplus country. They're just going to tighten fiscal policy. That is a political decision because economics, for all it's dressed up as being a technical question, actually has important political aspects to it. And the fact that, I mean, remember on the Greece point, Britain will become Greece if we don't have the Tory strategy. First of all, Greek debt is 2 to 3 times British levels. British debt is covered by our own deficits, are covered by our own borrowing at current levels. The maturity of our bonds is 12 to 14 years. In Greece, it's 12 to 14 weeks maximum, sometimes 12 to 14 days. So we're not in a Greek situation. It's a bit of politics that's being used. And what's happened around Europe is the dominance of the centre-right, and let's be honest about it, the weakness of the centre-left. And the weakness of the centre-left is part of this story. I would say a bigger part of the story than just a sort of demonisation of the bond traders, because the great thing in the temptation in politics is either to blame the voters or to blame the bond markets.
The point I would emphasize, though, is this is not a difference of democratic and autocratic governments, because try doing this in an autocracy, you'll get the same explosion. Yeah. You'll get the Tunisia rebellion, you'll get Egypt, you'll get the coup that's underway in Mali right now. It's This is governance, and it's tough right now, period. And and the challenges are going to get harder over time. And the question that is from a policy point of view, can you make sensible medium-term policies in this very difficult environment where you need a lot of global cooperation to do things, and you need to be able to do things that take time, that don't have immediate results. That's hard for any government to do.
But Jeff, don't we risk slipping? I mean, there's an aggregate effect that David's rightly pointing to, which is that if every government in Europe attempts to do austerity at the same time, the effect is a sort of Great Depression effect where everybody drives. If the idea of austerity is that you take economies that need structural reforms, and I think everybody agrees that Greece and Portugal need structural reforms, and they go through a sharp period of adjustments so that they can then grow in a new and more enterprising way, they need to be growing into some market. They've got to have somewhere to sell to. They've got to have... I just was in Tunisia yesterday, having bravely fought their revolution. Tunisia, I now really fear for. Everybody's unemployed.
Right.
No tourists from Europe are going down there, not just because they're afraid, but because Europe is contracting and contracting so fast. It seems to me that Europe is relying on China, Brazil, and other parts of the world to grow, and that's not enough.
Yeah,
Parts of Europe can grow, and if the whole of Europe does austerity at the same time, it will be at tremendous cost, not just to Europe, but to all the countries that rely on Europe.
I think
Very quick on this, 'cause I just want to do one.
I think there's a more important issue, in my opinion, about government, and that is not the short-term timing of deficits and so forth, but rather how large government is, what it does, how you balance taxes and spending. When you have to close a deficit, do you do it by 3/4 spending cuts, 1/4 tax increase, or do you do it some other way? To my mind, that gets to the core of what a society stands for, what its values are, what it sees as the role of market versus solidarity policies through the state, and so on. And I regard those policies as the most fundamental questions asked. What is true is that most of Europe in the center-right and right parties view the answer, cut spending, don't raise taxes. That, to me, is the more consequential question.